Welcome to Evolve, Reinventing Leadership, Building Freedom Cultures, with thought leader and award-winning author Yvette Bethel. This podcast provides you with insights and ideas you can use to reinvent your culture through trust and the principles of interconnectivity, flow, and balance. At a time when the world is rewriting the rules of work, traditional leadership practices are not enough. It's time to perceive persistent challenges through a new lens. It's time to evolve.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to Evolve, Reinventing Leadership, Building Freedom Cultures. I'm your host, Yvette Bethel, and in this conversation, Edwin and I will be discussing ecosystem leadership and why it's so necessary for the modern workplace. Now, my name is Yvette Bethel, and I'm an author, thought leader, speaker, consultant, and instructor. My thought leadership work is linked to human ecosystems, and today we will be introducing the IFB ecosystem model of leadership. Now, Edwin is joining me, and he's a co-host, and for this, he's also an adjunct professor in business. I don't know if you want to say where you are. Edwin.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
I'm good.
He describes himself as a higher order thinker focused on transformation. And Edwin's expertise is in emergent topics such as quantum, as well as traditional domains of knowledge. And this gives him insight into an organization's future potential. So welcome back, Edwin. We've had conversations several years ago, maybe 4, 5.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a
Yep.
while, but
It's good to be back of that.
yeah, it's really good to be back. And if you can say a little bit about quantum and what that has to do with, ecosystems, because it's really that's how our conversation started. We could just kind of
Yeah,
make the
so
connection.
sure. I think, when we speak, you're going to hear that I'm very philosophical. And I come back to a philosophical question often, like, what is the meaning of what we're talking about? And through that journey, you start to realize that we look at reality through metaphors. I don't know if that makes sense. So the ecosystem is a very, very functional metaphor that's rooted in how nature actually works. So that's one of the reasons we may talk about kind of using this metaphor as a way to transmit meaning. Another aspect of nature is actually quantum physics. It describes nature very, very well. And so it gives us kind of functional schema in which we can look and examine the world. And it kind of pulls out some insights into the world about us when we look at things using these different lenses. So I think we're going to look at things through 2 lenses tonight.
Yeah. And from what you're saying, it sounds like it's 2 lenses that kind of merge into one. Because with human ecosystems, they're alive, and organizations treat and the team as though it's a thing, but it's actually a living, breathing kind of entity that
Indeed.
it has a culture, which is a personality, has a
Mm-hmm.
mind of its own. Certain things it'll allow and certain things it doesn't. And what's interesting is you can have uh, different people leading the same company over multiple years, and the same kinds of things that the organization will allow or disallow kind of stick around. They they're embedded in there somehow and
Right.
into the personality. So it is a living thing. And it's responsive or it will reject.
Right. So as you're talking of that, you're using this idea of our person, our body, as another metaphor. So we have the ecosystem and the body. And I think where I bring the quantum in is quantum deals with complexity.
Mhm.
And so whether we're talking about the human body or an ecosystem, they're very complex, alive systems, like you're saying. So
Mhm.
some of the kind of the schema that we can take out from a quantum perspective, like dealing with paradox, for example, those concepts translate very well into these other paradigms, the ecosystem, the anthropomorphic conceptualization of an organization. So I think what you said, we can look at the same thing from different perspectives, use these different lenses to really dial in on phenomenon in organizations that are complex and we need to understand.
Yeah, I think the model that I designed to kind of work with this understanding, because it's multi-layered and, as you say, complex. It actually takes well, I shouldn't say takes advantage of, but it works in harmony with natural laws that exist within all living systems. So three of them are highlighted in the name of the model, but there are actually four that, we take a look at with the model, and there are many more. But the three that we focus on are interconnectivity, because everything's connected. When you look at an organization, it's an organism, and different parts of it, they all interconnect and kind of affect parts that people don't always think about. So the first part of the model is interconnectivity. Um, the second part is flow, because those connections come together in a way that allow or disallow flow, or kind of impede it. Well, that's disallowing. Well, impede it so that or circumvent it. And then you have balance, where there's a dynamic balancing effect that happens with the flows and with the lack of flow. The organism starts to balance itself and find some form of homeostasis so that it can survive. The interesting thing about the model is that no matter what kind of company you have, those same three um, natural laws operate. So if it's an unproductive company, you'll find the same three natural laws at work as a productive one.
Mhm, mhm,
So what we do is we anchor it with trust, because trust has a way of diffusing power. It has a way of making things flow differently and more effectively. And it really facilitates creativity. So that's a
mhm.
big nutshell, of the model. Um, and I think my question to you is, from a quantum perspective, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, I think when we use these different metaphors or models in your case to describe something, we're getting a perspective of the same thing.
Hmm.
So we should expect to see some resonance in those kind of theoretical conceptual models. And I think when you look at quantum, we've all heard the phrase wave particle duality. Well, our current worldview is based on kind of, if we want to say, particle physics.
Well,
Most people don't.
before you go on, please explain what
Yeah.
quantum is and wave particle, because
Okay.
not everybody's familiar with that.
Right. So I think when you say the word physics, it's uh, everybody understands that to be classical physics, shooting a ball through the air and trajectories and forces and velocities, things like that. Um, that way of thinking, that way of structuring things has kind of translated into how we think. So it's the discipline of physics creates kind of metaphors that we can use to understand the world around us. So
Mhm.
the particle physics is the particle in the wave particle duality. The other side of that, the wave, is kind of the fundamental metaphor of quantum. Okay, and a quantum is a piece of a particle. So it's the breakdown of the particle. And it actually operates on a different set of laws than the particle. So they're both things, they're both lenses that describe nature very, very well, but they give us very different perspectives, but they still resonate. So the wave is resonant with your idea of interconnectivity because every wave interconnects with every other wave. There's not really a wave per se, there's a wave field, and that's the interconnectivity of everything.
I think
Again,
I think you might need to use a kind of an example so that people can
okay,
understand
yeah,
because the theory may not translate for everybody.
right. So when I talk about a wave interconnecting with all the other waves, imagine a pond in a park
Mm,
and children are throwing rocks into those ponds. Well, you know where the rock lands, the wave starts to radiate out. But as those waves radiate out, they merge with each other. Okay,
right.
they basically pass through each other, and
Hmm.
they will continue to interact in that pool and reflections of the waves. So once those waves are created, they are interconnected. So this is kind of how we derive meaning from the metaphor of the wave. We can think about a pond and things like that.
I think with the wave too, it shows layers because as the wave kind of, reverberates out, uh, and they start to merge and integrate, that's how the interactions within an organizational ecosystem actually happen.
Right,
And it's hard to separate in some cases some of the or make distinctions because everything is so interconnected.
right. And so what you just said there is it's the reality is things are hard to separate. And I think
Mhm.
when you look at the quantum and its approach to complexity, it kind of acknowledges that. Whereas the older type of thinking is very much about only looking at the things you can separate out. So
Mhm.
we take it and we study this individual thing,
Mhm.
but which is useful to know this. But
Mhm.
what we're not understanding is the thing within the relationship of all the other things.
You know,
So it's this is why like the current approach, like management science and everything like that, tends to, I mean, it does well at some things like maximizing profit, but in terms of organizational dynamics, it really struggles to get to the truth of the matter.
yeah, because in actuality, interconnectivity, flow, and balance are not linear. They're actually overlaid. So
Right,
you have the interconnectivity happening that's creating flows. It's not, it could be sequential, but it could be kind of overlaid. Um,
right,
so it's I think in ecosystem leadership, you have to start to see things different through a new lens. It's
right,
not the
right.
same linear kind of approach. And I think you used this. I think you said something about these linear kind of approaches in one of our very old or past
Right.
conversations. I shouldn't say old, but certainly one of our past conversations. Do you want to share on that?
Um, yes, I think again I look at it like philosophically and metaphorically. If this older style, the scientific, classical scientific style of thinking is about the particle, you take one particle and you put another particle and we just create a straight line between them, and that gives you a kind of linear model there. Like, and uh, we esteem linear thinking as if that's the perfect form of thought, right? So
Right.
we've idealized this and we pursue this singular direction. When you shift over into the the quantum metaphor, waves are nonlinear. That's in a sense they're the antithesis of the linear. So the wave is nonlinear, and it gives you a whole, tapping into that metaphor gives you a whole um, new perspective on the same dynamic. So, when we talked about interconnectivity, we have flow. And I think one of the things as you really start to question what is the meaning that we can pull from a quantum construct, one of those one of those things is what you call flow. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We go from being very point oriented. This is the end point. We're reaching that, and that's really all we care about is that end point, to this concept of the wave, which is an ongoing process. And that is that process. I use the word process. It's the same basic concept as flow.
What what
Um,
what about a circular cyclic? Because you're using wave, but I think people sometimes
yes,
see it as a circular kind of thing where
yes,
seasons or cycles
right,
happen within. Yeah, if you can use that too as a metaphor, that would be
right.
helpful.
Yeah, so actually, if you were to draw the action of a wave, uh, but you weren't displaying time, like a wave goes like this over time, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you don't show it in time, if you just show position, it's a circle.
Mm-hmm.
So in fact, the circle is just another way to represent a wave. It's just showing it like without change over time. It's just the kind of the mechanism. So, for example, Ray Dalio, who's been writing lately on economics, his metaphor that he describes economic principles is the big cycle, right? So he's
Mm-hmm.
effectively tapping into these other structural metaphors instead of thinking about the linear thinking.
That's right.
um, we're now he's now looking at economics through this quantum metaphor, and I don't know if you've read his recent book, but it is fantastic thought, and it's quite radically different
Mm-hmm.
in its outcome, and how we got to that point was just using a different lens. So whether
Mm-hmm.
we're using your model or a quantum model, it's giving valuable insights.
Yeah,
And
because I think in making it practical, what happens when you use a model like the IFB model?
mhm,
You start to have a whole new view of the organization. You start to see it through a new lens. Things that you didn't notice before become more apparent, and so you can address them. That's the point.
yes,
Because
and I will
otherwise, oh, go ahead.
no, um, I think what you just said, that the need to address them, um, in the end, if we are not working or running our organizations based on this kind of shared understanding, your IFB model or quantum model, whatever. But if we're not aligning our actions with kind of loosely saying the laws of nature, how things work in
Right,
reality,
right.
uh, we're not going to get what we want in the end, because nature's the for example, human nature, how people truly behave,
Hmm.
isn't going to change. Okay, you can, if you're not managing the situation well, you're not going to get the outcome you want, because human nature is what it is.
Or what will happen is what I see in organizations quite a lot, where you'll make the change and it looks like a change, it smells like a change, you know, but
Yes,
it's all superficial. And so
right,
something happened externally, but internally and under the surface, everything's still the same.
right. I think there has to be this willingness to shift to dealing with more complexity in your model,
Mhm.
which is what you're bringing to the table, because you know 100 years ago organizations were much simpler. you know you had guys who went and chopped down trees or something. That's it's pretty There's not a lot to the organizational meat there. Now we have very, very complex organizations
Mhm.
that are operating in dynamic environments.
Mhm.
So if you're not using a model to look at the world like IFB or quantum, you are missing all that complexity, which will have a real world impact on your business.
Mhm. But yeah, I know you lecture at a college or university or several. and I guest lecture, and some of the lenses or theories and models that are taught there are things that I learned back in the 80s. Like, for example, I lectured at a college the other day, and they're still teaching theory X and theory Y, which to me is
Right.
like mind-blowing because you have different generations, ways of thinking, all kinds of things have changed since those theories have come out, but yet they are still what's being taught, which means that the people that are learning this are learning that, people are lazy, or, some people are not, or whatever. And I don't think it's that simple, to your point. It's not that it's not that simple anymore.
It's not. Right.
So there may be some, I don't even know that it's laziness. They just may not be motivated because different things are important to them than used to be when the traditional models were made,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, I think there's momentum has great power. So when our mindset is going in one direction,
Mhm.
and in a sense, that direction going back to like particle physics, it's a momentum. It's kind of set where our mind is going to go. So even though academia progresses, those structures that
Affixed.
they assume are pretty like rigid, and so you really don't see much deviation, even though we know better now.
Hmm.
I know. I mean, in physics, they still talk about um, electricity as a particle. That's not true, but
Hmm.
it's so important to stay within that kind of structural metaphor that everything else is taught in, that we kind of overlook those things and we miss the opportunity to gain new insights.
Yeah, because the structure becomes the lens.
Yes,
And
yes,
whether they're aware of it or not, it's the lens. And so
right,
therefore they can't see all of the nuances and different things that
right.
have changed. Not
Well,
that
I
they,
think
go ahead.
Yeah, I think for those of us who maybe back in the day remember that, the big cameras before we had them on our
Yes, yeah,
phones,
yeah,
and you have a lens on it. That lens has a focal plane,
yeah. Hmm.
and you will only really see clearly what's in that distance of space that's within its focal plane. Things that are behind or in front just become very blurred out to the point where you don't pick up on them.
Hmm.
And so the lens that we currently look through, that academia works through, in a sense, is restricting their ability to fully see the whole picture. They
Yes,
just see a slice of the picture.
yes.
And I think so. To your point, yes, people are still learning these old models as if they work. You know, they have worked to an extent, but the problems we now face as a society, as businesses,
Yeah.
these are
They
problems that are
transcend that.
rooted in,
Yeah.
yeah, they're complex problems. And what we're doing kind of goes back to that saying, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The only thing that we know is hammer, and you just beat on everything.
Yeah.
There is much more elegant ways to address the challenges that we face, but to get that level of elegance, you have to go to a higher order, more complex theoretical model, which you
But
have done.
and and I think you're absolutely right, but not everybody wants to make it more complex or see it as something more complex because it's easier, it's simpler, to
Right.
stick to the traditional way of doing things. So from your perspective, what are some things that I don't know if science shows this, but some ways that we can start to make the shift because I know that people want simplicity. They want it to be, you know, linear. They want it to be, unidimensional. Like,
Yes.
how do we make this shift and make it simply and practically? Because it's not, people want a practical solution.
Right. Right. And I think this is quite a challenge, I think, to translate the conceptual understanding down to the practical.
Hmm.
Um, but I think we can, how do I approach this? We can recognize that there are problems that we face or our industry faces that are kind of existential problems. And we need to look at those problems with a different way of thinking.
Hmm.
So, for example, if you take the retail industry, the bricks and mortar industry, I mean, that was a train wreck that was visible a long time before it happened.
Yeah.
Um, I think that when people find themselves in these positions, for example, people at OpenAI, today, their reality today is much, much different than last week, right? Because China just made such an astounding move in AI that it just upset the whole apple cart.
Hmm.
Now they're going to have to go back and say, okay, we need to deal with a different situation. Our old assumptions didn't work. We need to look at those new assumptions.
That's right.
And I think what I'm saying is that the probably the first step when people are facing complexity is to ask themselves, what are the assumptions that I'm working on?
Hmm.
Okay. And to challenge themselves to justify those assumptions. Um, so, for example, an assumption in business is growth. Um, we're going to start a company and we're going to grow the company and we're going to keep growing the company. That's kind of the assumed approach to business. Uh, a company might want to ask themselves, do we want to follow that model? The model many other companies that have had explosive growth have followed, and then they run into challenges and then they fail.
Hmm.
Maybe we're shifting out of the assumption of growth into the assumption of sustainable business. It's better for us to have a comparable business in 100 years from now
Yeah.
than to blow it up and collapse in 5.
Yeah, I think the buzzword now is future proofing. And
Right.
it's really about um, making sure that the organization survives. Because with the way that the whole environment is so unpredictable now,
Right.
you need to be able to move and shift and not be kind of consumed by it, uh, losing your footing because there's so much going on and there's so many layers of it that responsiveness is now it's not a choice anymore. You have to be able to be responsive, and I think the pandemic taught us that.
Right. And I think I'm just thinking, you're over there in the Bahamas, you're familiar with boats and sailing. Um, and I'm envisioning a boat with its sails out, kind of leaning over, going through the sea there.
Hmm.
It's in the milieu of all the influences happening. So it's interconnected by the ocean. It's
Ocean,
flowing in
the
movement,
wind,
but it's
the
but it's also got
weight.
that balance,
Yeah,
right? So you've got the force of the wind blowing on the sails, and then the weight of the keel
that's right.
holding it in balance. And so I think that when you're looking at this, the balance part becomes a really essential thing because in the end, natural systems, ecosystems, or the human body, one of the core principles that they both operate on is some kind of homeostasis,
That's right.
some kind of balance within the system, right? So I think when
And
these, I mean,
that's
you
the key
see
to
it,
the sustainability. That's the key to the
right?
sustainability, the
I mean,
homeostasis.
and we've been reading I've been reading the business press my entire career, and it's always this amazing company, that just kind of got too big, got too complex, and then it collapsed, right?
Yeah.
There's hundreds of thousands of companies over my career that have been like that because they were not equipped to deal with that kind of complexity.
Right.
And so I think that especially larger organizations, complex organizations need to be willing to go to an IFB model or to go, to look at things kind of through this quantum lens because they're dealing with complexity and they're not equipped to deal with complexity.
Yeah. Yeah. Or they're using more simplistic models that cannot
Right,
give the insight into the complexity. It's always going to be a superficial
right,
solution,
right,
or they're solving for the symptoms and not
right,
because I think for me, IFB takes you in and you actually looking for the root causality as opposed to,
right,
fixating on the symptoms and getting rid of those symptoms. So it's like solving a client's complaint. You
right,
solve
right,
it,
exactly.
you make the client happy, but then there's something that caused that issue to
Hmm.
happen. It
Right,
goes ignored because it's finished. If with some
right.
organizations will go deeper. So
Hmm.
it's a matter of just going deeper, and I think the model helps with that because one thing that we provide is to really go through the layers is we provide decks of canvases. Like typically, you get one canvas, but because this is such a layered model, there are multiple canvases for multiple kinds of perspective that provide multiple perspectives. So that the deeper in you go, the more likely it is that you'll actually solve what you define it and solve it.
Right, right. It's yeah, but I think to me it just becomes really clear like we've got these mindsets and
Mm.
people are not really it's almost like having to learn another language.
Exactly,
Like it
exactly.
takes that level of effort to transform your thinking.
Yeah.
Uh but I think that's relevant to a lot of organizations because again we can go back to look at the history of the business press over the last 20 years. And there are these organizations that have been tremendously successful, and then they
Hmm.
start to run into the complexity, and they'll spend a decade or 2 decades and billions of dollars and doing all kinds of reorganizations and this and that, trying to get that advantage back, and they can never do it
Hmm.
because, like you said, they're working on a paradigm which is out of focus with their reality.
That's it.
It's like
That's
wearing
it.
somebody else's glasses. You just
Yeah.
can't quite see what you need to see.
Yeah. And they end up having to merge or they get acquired.
Right.
It's because the complexity, there's always a point, and some of the complexity has to do with culture.
Yes.
Because
Right.
it's like a je ne sais quoi. They can't put their finger on it
Right.
because the culture worked before.
Right.
And so culture plays an important part in the whole ecosystem because of the living component, the people component.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's amazing when you can bring yourself to utilize these other lenses because
Hmm.
you learn so much. I mean, if we think about how we have learned scientifically about the world and the universe, a lot of that science has to do with the lenses. You've got microscopes and electron microscopes and
Exactly.
telescopes and space telescopes. They're all essentially what we're doing in science is trying to amass the collection of lenses that we need to really see the whole picture. So
Hmm.
I think for organizational practitioners, you know, it would behoove them to pick up these additional lenses because then they can literally address problems at different levels within the organization
Hmm.
because they have the lens to actually observe what's happening.
Yeah, it's always going to boil down to your lens and your capacity to see systems because I think people see problems and then they try to solve the problem But if they can, and they see the problem as something maybe as more static than it actually is. When you
Right.
start to look at it and start to see how interconnected that challenge is, and what's what are some of the, peripheral kinds of connections that contribute to holding it in place? For example, a lot of people try to solve interpersonal challenges within a team, right? They'll
Right.
bring in coaches, they'll do training and this type of thing, but they don't look at the structures that are holding it in place. They don't look at the assumptions that you spoke about that are holding it in place. So even if you do the work, the interpersonal work, um, it's still it's like elastic. It'll just like snap back into place because the system and the structures were developed based on assumptions and a lens
Right.
that
Right.
that 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 and therefore it's designed to hold it in place.
Right. Right. Yes, and that's what it happens. In a sense, you're 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 trying to yeah, you're basically reinforcing the root problem there, which is the
Yeah,
perspective that's happening. I think it's fair to say at this point, most of the practice of organizational leadership and management is based on those outdated ideas. Marketing, I mean, whatever the fields we're talking about, finance, marketing, blah blah blah, they're
hmm
all rooted in this very
Just
limited paradigm.
hmm
One of the you use the word static. I mean, that's one of the artifacts that comes with that way of thinking.
yes,
It's very
yes,
static,
yes,
and it's simplified down to a single variable, customer satisfaction score or profit or whatever.
yes.
And it's a static thing that they're kind of looking at it like it's fixed. You have to ask yourself, am I dealing with a simple system or a complex system? And if you're dealing with complexity, whether it's human complexity or technical complexities, whatever size or however that comes to be, if you are dealing with complexity and you're using those old tools, you are missing what's going on. You're approaching, yeah, you're approaching every problem you have with that hammer and surprised by the results.
I think too, people misunderstand or conflate the fact that simple doesn't mean small necessarily. You can
Right.
have really complex,
Mm-hmm.
small organizations or small systems uh,
Mm-hmm.
with all kinds of layers of things going on.
Right.
And
Right.
if you don't have people that understand the layering and how to kind of pull it apart so you can take a look in.
Right. Right.
Again, it's still a challenge because that assumption that small means simple, it just doesn't work in today's environment. It may be,
Right. Right.
but you
Right.
can't assume that up front.
Yeah, I think that's why we see creative firms generally are quite small
Mm-hmm.
because that intensity of human interaction becomes so complex that it
Mm-hmm.
kind of there's a natural limit to the degree of complexity that people can handle. So
Right.
very, very intensive interaction type organizations are going to be relatively small and still deal with that same level of complexity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot that needs to happen in terms of shifting the lenses or, the way that we see the world, a worldview or a business organizational view,
Yes, right,
whatever you want to call it.
right. It's lots of work, and I think people who are serious practitioners in their field need to be looking at this.
Yeah. But the question is, who's a serious practitioner? I think everybody thinks they are, but everybody's busy. With my clients, everybody's always busy. Like,
Right,
where do they find the time? They don't have the time to go deep. They have the time to solve it at the surface level.
Yeah, yes, and I think that in a sense, like we talked about, the mindset tends to reinforce itself.
Hmm.
Um, that the way of seeing things that way is kind of baked into that worldview. I would say you don't have the time not to do this. This should be a priority, especially for anybody who's really at that leadership level. I mean, there are, if you're talking about like a big business, of course, there in the end it becomes very task oriented, and those people
Mm.
need to get their work done. So you can't have 500 managers, devoting half of their work week to these existential questions. But the people at the top of the organization should, because in a sense, that is their job, is to provide wise leadership in complex times.
Well,
And
let me give an example. Like I have
yes,
a client, I have multiple clients like this, where there's not enough time in the day. They have clients around the world. The demands are always increasing. They're already working past the 8, 9, 10 hour days that
mhm,
they're supposed to work. Um, the Sometimes the work isn't being done, things are being overlooked. Like they are incredibly and justifiably busy. It
yes,
and even in their free time, they're on the phone, like, during the vacation, they're on the phone dealing with things
mhm,
that come up and that need their input. Um, and everyone in the organization is that busy. Well, just about, not everyone, but you have like a lot of people that are so busy that they are burning out. With another client, uh, the team members were starting to have, they need psychological support because of the level of burnout. So when
right,
you start going into the extremes like that, which I see it quite often, more often now than before.
mhm,
Um, it's You can say to people, yeah, find the time, but they don't even have the mental strength to kind of support that because you're just exhausted. So it, there has to be a way. Because in today's workplace, busyness is real, and it's
right,
because if after the pandemic, I use that as a point where some
mhm,
organizations downsized, so they're doing more with less, um,
right,
or they've changed how some things happen. And some organizations expanded. Yeah, I would admit that, but certainly there's a busyness
mhm.
that needs to be addressed. I'm not sure what the answer is to that. Um,
Yeah, I think it's very hard to speak into the individual person's circumstances, because there can be, in terms of what they should do, there can be so many different answers depending on the context. Um,
but I brought it up not for that reason. I brought it up because
mhm,
it seems to be a theme, even though each individual circumstance may be different. There's a theme
right,
of burnout or overextension where people
right.
are. So I think that's something that also needs to be realistically integrated because the whole model has a dynamic balancing component.
Yes. Well, I think what you just said there, this is kind of where my thought was going, is that you have to allow your situation to balance itself. You have it, okay, the pressures are there, but you're just kicking the can down the road when
Right.
you don't allow those pressures to adjust your behavior. Um, and I I think that finding the time, or well, maybe finding the time is not the right word, because they're strapped for time, but giving yourself permission to adjust the balance. Like, okay, we had a goal of 20% profit this year, and everybody's burning out, and we're going to lose our team next year if we don't back off of that. Okay, I mean, maybe taking a 15% profit this year and retaining your team is a really good trade-off.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
That makes sense.
so allowing your organizations, instead of fighting the challenge, allowing that to feedback, and we're talking about that cycle again.
Mm-hmm.
Why is this becoming such a big problem for us?
Mm-hmm.
What's the assumption under there? Is it like just we're going to grab as much money as we can at this moment because it tends to be feast or famine in our industry, or what? Look at some of those assumptions that are kind of keeping you trapped into this situation that you're never able to get out of.
I mean, what you're describing is a negative feedback kind
Right,
of a cycle where you
right,
push to a point, and then people start collapsing. But I think there needs to be more mindfulness so that people are not collapsing before. That should
right.
not be the threshold. The threshold should
Yeah,
be much earlier than that, so that you can sustain performance over a long period of time, as opposed to burnout and then people are falling out and then sick,
absolutely.
and then you get turnover and other issues. Um,
Right, right, right. I think,
or quiet quitting, which is something that's happening more now, where people just give up and they stop making an effort.
right, right. Um, yeah, allow, that feedback is really, I mean, no engineer would ever design a complex system without the feedback loops in it. In our
Mhm.
vehicles, we have temperature sensors and this and that, because one of those parameters gets out of whack and everything gets ruined,
Yeah.
right? So, in a sense, when we're building these organizations and we're not accommodating for that feedback in our kind of direction for the organization, it's like, okay, I'm just going to cut the temperature sensor wire because it keeps buzzing at me. I mean, yes, we can
But
get a temporary fix to solve the symptom that we're, the annoying buzzer, but at a long-term substantial cost, our engine gets wrecked.
But they are building in the feedback. I think they ignore it because it comes in the form of complaints, and nobody wants to hear complaints.
Right, right,
My approach to complaints is listen, connect the dots if they can be, to see if there's anything in there that's valuable,
right,
and
right,
then let the rest of it go. Because
right,
in most cases, the complaints have some valid kind of
right,
nugget within
right,
them, but the way it's being delivered, it just turns off the listener.
right. I see a similar dynamic in medicine where uh, pain, which is analogous to the complaints, was always viewed negatively. Like pain is the problem.
Mm,
And we've had this shift in medicine to like pain is the messenger. So the pain is actually telling us something.
right.
And we need to listen to that and go get it checked out. And we derive, even though in a sense the experience is painful, we're deriving, or we can derive value out of that transaction if we choose to. So
Hmm.
you're right. These feedback mechanisms, we've got to shift our thinking from, I don't want pain, to pain can be a helpful messenger sometimes to tell
Right.
me before it becomes a big problem.
Right. And so the threshold for action should happen sooner rather than when it really has to happen, because then you have other
Right.
collateral damage that's happening.
Yes. Right. Right. Exactly. Right.
Edwin, I could talk to you forever, but we've already gone over an hour.
All right.
So I think this is a great place to kind of sign off, and we can resume our next call in um
Great.
1 second. So with that, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you to Edwin for this really, I mean, I was engaged. So thank you for that. I didn't notice the time.
No,
But
thank you, Yvette. It's great chatting with you.
yeah, and if you want to just share with the audience, how they can connect with you or find you, or if you want to be found.
Yeah. Yeah. So Edwin, last name is Clamp, CLAMP. You can find me on LinkedIn, and my email is edwin@edwinclamp.com. Easy to remember.
Ah,
Send
yes.
me a note.
Yes, and you can find me and at Yvette Bethel on LinkedIn, or you can find out more about IFB and the courses that we offer at the IFB Academy, and I will provide the link below. So, with that, I'd like to say thank you for joining us at Evolve, Reinventing Leaders, Building Freedom Cultures.
Thank you for listening to Evolve, Reinventing Leadership, Building Freedom Cultures. Learn more about our proprietary trust, leadership, and culture courses and certifications at the IFB Academy. You can check them out at organizationalsoul.learnworlds.com.